Hi, in this video we want to go over developmental rubrics and how they can be used as evidence of learning, particularly in the way that the criteria written in developmental rubrics are descriptions of student performance in a skill. And once you understand and are able to write developmental rubrics, there's a whole heap of benefits from them, which we'll discuss at the end. So we want to use an example of the skills required for baking a cake. So what kind of skills might be required for baking a cake? Measuring, organising, mixing and icing. Now obviously there are more than just those 4 skills involved in baking a cake, but the point here is that in any developmental rubric you need to sample from the total number of skills that are possibly involved. There's no point assessing every single possible skill. You're just going to be giving the learner too much feedback, which they're not going to be able to do much with. So here's a developmental rubric for baking a cake. I've got those 4 skills there. They're listed as verbs, so this makes it easier for the learner to know what they're going to be doing, saying, making or writing. So let's go ahead and put in the lowest level criteria. These should be something that all learners in the class or in the group can do. So there they are there. You'll note again that these are all listed starting with verbs, and these are all statements that describe performance, describe different qualities of performance that learners might demonstrate when they are baking a cake. So let's go ahead and fill in the rest of the criteria. There we go there. So these are different ways that learners might be demonstrating their skills of baking a cake. Yeah, so you could watch a person bake a cake and assess them on that rubric and think, how did they go with their measuring, organising, mixing and icing. So for an example, let's assume that the student was assessed as having done everything in blue. Yeah, so we watch the student baking the cake and we decide that they've measured accurately, they've ordered the correct ingredients, they've pre-sifted all the dry ingredients and they've iced the cake consistently, but they haven't done the stuff above that. So in this example, it's assumed that the student can do everything up to what they were assessed at. So we assess them as the middle row for all of the 4 skills. It's assumed that they can also do any of the beneficial stuff below that, right? So if they can ice the cake consistently, then they should also know how to put icing on the cake. Obviously, they would be required to do that. When it comes to mixing, if they've pre-sifted all the dry ingredients, it's assumed that they've also combined the ingredients. Same with organising. If they've ordered the correct ingredients, it's assumed they've also ordered the food items. And if they measure accurately, it's also assumed that they put ingredients in a bowl, right? So just looking at this alone, we can say we know 8 things that the student can do. It's everything up to and including whatever they were assessed at. Now, here comes the fun bit. Okay, so we're saying that the student can do everything in blue, and now what are some areas for improvement? Basically all the stuff that you see there in green. So any criteria that's written above what they're assessed at is something that they should work on next. That should also provide you with some kind of guidance about a teaching intervention that you might want to give students. So for example, in this case, if the student is icing the cake consistently, but they haven't done it decoratively, then some kind of teaching intervention might include decorative icing of the cake. Equally here with mixing, something that the student could be taught to do better would be to mix the batter all the way until it's smooth, rather than perhaps suggesting there that it's lumpy, and so on. So the great thing about this is that once you've assessed the student against a well-written developmental rubric, you've got all kinds of information that you can use for reporting. So you could say in a report format or whatever that the student can do all of the things in blue there, and what do they need to do to get better? All of the stuff that's in green. You can the level that they were assessed at, this top blue level, this is what Vygotsky would call their ZAD, their zone of actual development. This is what they can actually do. So their ZPD, the zone of proximal development, the stuff that they could do with the help of a more knowledgeable other, i.e. a teacher or a more capable student, is the stuff that's in green here. So this is where you're going to find that teaching intervention is going to be most effective. So just to put that in perspective, just a quick chat about the assessment process. There's a couple of different ways to assess student performance, both formal and informal. The formal obviously being things like tests or formal assignments that students do. However, it's very easy to informally assess students' performance on a developmental rubric simply by observing them in a classroom situation or something like that. There's 3 steps in the assessment process. There's collection, interpretation, and use. So there's 3 different ways that assessment evidence can be interpreted. The first way is norm referenced, so that's comparing it to norms. So for example, Shiner is in the lowest quartile. That's saying that that's comparing Shiner to what the norm or expected level might be for students at that level. You typically find the Australian and state-based curriculum documents are norm referenced. However, we believe that probably the most useful for student growth is criterion referenced interpretation of assessment information that compares students to criteria to see what they are capable of doing, and the assessment describes performance. Yeah, so in the developmental rubrics, the developmental rubric for that cake baking that we looked at, it was comparing students to criteria, saying, can they order the correct ingredients or not, and if they can, then that gets shaded in, and that assessment is simply to describe the student's performance. Benefit there, I think one of the many benefits of criterion referencing over norm referencing is that there's no judgment in the assessment of the student, and given the many differing uses of assessment over the years, a lot of it has been overly judgmental, which I think can be quite demotivating to students, particularly at the top and the bottom of the ability spectrum. So, for example, the statement about Shiner and criterion reference interpretation would be Shiner can model fractions. It's simply telling somebody what they are capable of doing. The third one is standards referencing, which is kind of similar to norms, and that would be Shiner is below standard. So you also see that used in the curriculum as well. There's a standard for a certain year level, and either students are at that standard or not. We've highlighted in green criterion referencing because we've found that is the one that produces the most student growth. Finally, the final use of assessment, the final of the 3 parts of assessment process is use. There's a couple of different ways that you can use assessment information. You can use it formatively or summatively. Now, just a quick word on terminology. You often hear people talk about formative assessments and summative assessments. Technically, the assessment itself is not formative or summative. It's what you do with the information. So if you gave an assessment, right at the end of the year, wrote a report, sent the kids on their summer holidays, you'd be using that summatively as a summation of what they have learned. Whereas if you gave that assessment at the start as, say, a pre-assessment or during the teaching intervention and used it to target your teaching or for some other purpose, that would be a formative use of the assessment. So formative and summative use of assessment is the correct way to think about it, rather than the assessments themselves being formative or summative. Now, obviously, both have their place. In terms of skill, in terms of student progress, formative use of assessment information is better because it improves teaching. So just a real quick look at rubric construction, and this video should be watched in conjunction with the other video about rubric writing advice. So remember that we have our skills written as verbs at the bottom. The bottom level is something that everyone in the class should be able to do. The top level is something that should be a stretch target even for your most capable students, and then you fill in the middle levels with typical stopping off points for students of different ability, and it's okay if there's big gaps in there. So just a real quick word on the, also it's a really good idea to have an interpretation statement telling all the users of the rubric how to interpret it. Obviously in a classroom situation you'll be teaching the students how to interpret the rubrics, but this can be quite useful for parents who might not know how to interpret rubrics that they get shown to them of their children's performance. So just briefly, some benefits of developmental rubrics, and we could go on about this all day, but we'll just do one slide on it. Firstly, for students, they know what they can do and how to get better. They know what they can do in a non-judgmental way. They're just told this is your current ability in whatever skill or use of knowledge. There's no judgment attached to that. And that assessment is used as information rather than judgment. For parents, you see more motivated children, particularly those on the extremes of the ability spectrum. So what we've found is that students, particularly at the low or high ability, really benefit from developmental rubrics because there's no judgment involved. So students at the low end, they're simply told what they can do in a positive way, not using any negative language in the rubric itself, and then they've got some information about what they can do to get better. And definitely for those students at the high end of the ability spectrum, when they are given stretch targets, things that are difficult even for them, a lot of these students at the high end of the ability spectrum have never really seen what it looks like to get better, but with well-written rubrics with stretch targets at the top, they can. And briefly, teachers, writing rubrics can take time, but that time, the time spent on writing rubrics should in the long run make your marking both more consistent between teachers and a lot quicker. You get a lot more information, more detailed information for reporting, and it can reduce the need for individualized comments if you teach people how to interpret the rubric. And finally, it allows teachers to know where students are ready to learn, so it gives them some information about how they might want to target their teaching. Thank you very much.